Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to get into this issue as to whether the state or the government, driven by Democrats, is unfairly, perhaps illegally, targeting former President Donald Trump. My first guest today, legal scholar Alan Dershowitz, who represented Donald Trump in the first Senate impeachment trial, writes this, quote, "Now that Donald Trump has announced his candidacy for re-election as president, the unremitting efforts by his political opponents to get him, to stop him from running, at any cost will only increase. These efforts may pose the most significant threat to civil liberties since McCarthyism." That's from the book called Get Trump, The Threat to Civil Liberties, Due Process, and Our Constitutional Rule of Law. Again, it is written by our guest, Alan Dershowitz. Alan Dershowitz is the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law Emeritus at Harvard Law School, and he has worked and advised some of the most famous and controversial figures over the years, including O.J. Simpson, Patty Hearst, Julian Assange, and Jeffrey Epstein. Alan Dershowitz, I thank you for taking this time to talk to me today.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Let me just continue. The very next sentence after the quote I just read, here's the next thing that you say, quote, "Though the end may seem commendable to many, stopping Trump from retaking the presidency, some of the means being advocated and employed challenge the very constitutional foundations of our liberty, due process, right to counsel, free speech, and rule of law." As we begin, can you talk to me about what are some of these things that you think are a threat to the constitutional foundations of this country?
Sure. First, let me start by saying I do think attempts to try to prevent Trump from becoming president again through lawful democratic means are commendable. I join those attempts. I don't want to vote for him. I didn't vote for him twice previously. I intend to vote against him if he gets the nomination this time. What I worry about is district attorneys and attorneys general running for office on the explicit promise to get somebody. That's Stalinism, not Americanism. Prosecutors should not be targeting people and then looking for crimes on which to charge them. There's a famous exchange between Lavrentiy Beria, the head of the KGB, and Stalin, where Stalin says, "Show me the man," and where Beria says, "Show me the man" to Stalin, and I'll find you the crime. Robert Jackson, who is probably the greatest attorney general in our history, said that to his attorneys general and assistant attorneys general, with the plethora of statutes and regulations now on the books, any prosecutor can rummage through the statute books and find something to pin on somebody that they don't like. That's not the American way. The American way is to see a crime and then search for who did it, not to see a person and search for crime. So I think that's the most fundamental threat to civil liberties that we're seeing. Equally with that is an attempt to get lawyers who represented Trump. For example, I represented Trump in his first impeachment, though I'm a liberal Democrat. I was proud to do so. It cost me enormous numbers of funds, even relatives. And now an organization called Project 65 is determined to try to get every lawyer who ever represented Trump, filing bar charges, filing complaints against every lawyer, including me, who ever represented Trump. That is a great threat to civil liberties. It's what happened during McCarthyism when people I knew, great lawyers, were subject to bar complaints because they represented people who had been accused of communism. So that's a fundamental threat to civil liberties. Those are the two primary ones, the targeting and the going after lawyers. And the reason it's far more dangerous than McCarthyism ever was is McCarthyism was a phenomenon that looked backward, it looked to the past. It was done by older men who were at the end of their careers, essentially, and it tried to uncover people who had been communists in the 1930s. This was the 1950s when this happened. Whereas this new McCarthyism is a phenomenon of the future. It affects young people, college students, professors, the people who will be our leaders in 20 years. And the precedents that are established in the Get Trump movement will become precedents for the future. That's why it's more dangerous than McCarthyism.
I'm going to quote you from your book one last time. You say this, quote, "It is precisely because so many decent people honestly believe that a second Trump presidency would endanger our nation that it is difficult to persuade them that their attacks on our cherished constitutional rights will cause enduring, perhaps irremediable, harm to our liberties. The fact that they may be right, at least to some degree, makes it more dangerous. That line there, they may be right, at least to some degree. Do you think Donald Trump as president is dangerous?
I wouldn't vote for him. I think his speech on January 6th posed a danger to America. I do think that it would be far better to have a more moderate centrist president, and I will work in that direction. But there are people, I mean, my relatives, I have relatives, close relatives, who really have analogized Donald Trump to Adolf Hitler and have analogized me to Goebbels and Goering for being a facilitator, even though I voted against him. When Larry David came up to me in Martha's Vineyard, where we've been friends for, 25 years, I helped his daughter get into college. I advised him on his show on numerous occasions. When he came up to me and screamed at me that he would never talk to me again, that I'm disgusting, I could see the veins in his forehead bursting, practically. He really meant it. He really thought he was talking to a Goering or Goebbels, and he really thought he was talking about Adolf Hitler. He's sincere. He means it. But as Justice Brandeis, great justice, once said, the greatest danger to liberty lurks in men and women of zeal who believe they're right, but without understanding. And that's the phenomenon we're seeing. Well-intentioned people thinking they're doing the right thing and destroying our constitutional rights in the process.
Well, let me stick with that. People who think they are doing the right thing, and ask a hypothetical. If you do have a political figure who rises to power through constitutional means, through the democratic system, and then once in power uses the same system to hold on to power at the threat of that same very system. And you mentioned Hitler, but I don't mean to make this even about Hitler. I get the problem about comparing Trump to Hitler, but we've seen this happen in history a lot,
Sure.
all over the world. If there is a figure who is using the system to try to make them to hurt the system itself and to strengthen their own hand, would that require extraordinary measures to try to stop?
Extraordinary, perhaps unconstitutional, never. And of course, this is not the first time in our history we've seen this done, and good people have done it. Franklin Delano Roosevelt put 110,000 people in detention centers because he thought that was the right thing. History has had a very different verdict. Oliver Wendell Holmes and Louis Brandeis allowed the sterilization of, 50,000 people who were thought to be mentally retarded in order to improve the eugenics of the race. And that was thought to be right at the time. And the verdict of history has been very much against that.
It certainly has. But was that, well, I mean, maybe it was a threat against the Constitution, right? A threat against their own rights, I guess.
Was a threat against the Constitution, against due process. When President Woodrow Wilson had the Palmer raids, he thought that was the right thing because immigrants were threatening America. History has looked at that verdict negatively, and sometimes there are close questions. Abraham Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus and arrested people, not for what they had done, but for fear of what they might do in the future. The Supreme Court overruled that ultimately. And we have methods of getting rid of tyrants, and we've shown those methods work. We have a system of checks and balances, separation of powers, that makes it very difficult for a president to alone do what some presidents would like to have done. As Madison said, if men were angels, we wouldn't need laws. We need laws because men aren't angels, and the law is designed to protect against tyrants, both good and bad, both well-intentioned and evilly intentioned tyrants. And remember, even evilly intentioned tyrants sometimes think they're doing the right thing. Mussolini, made the trains run on time. But we cannot ever, under any circumstances, allow unconstitutional or illegal means to be used, no matter how serious the threat. We have to always fight it by lawful and legal means. And that's the thrust of my book, Get Trump. Don't compromise the Constitution because of Trump. That what you're doing to get Trump is more dangerous than what Trump would do if he were elected president. That's my view. People might disagree with it, but I think it has the verdict of history. on my side.
And would you feel that way? I mean, oftentimes we have this discussion. If you can go back in time, would you kill Hitler before
Yes.
he rose as chancellor? I mean, would you have the same view, the same defense for?
No, I would not be acting as a lawyer. I'd be acting as a criminal. I'd be acting in civil disobedience. Yes, I would have done everything in my power to kill him and to prevent what he did. But I would immediately resign from the bar if I did that. I wouldn't claim to have been doing anything consistent with the Constitution, which these folks are doing. They claim they're stretching the Constitution to fit him, but assassinating Hitler would have been the right thing to do. And I would have been proud to do it. And if I ever thought there was somebody who was like Hitler, I would be proud to do it again. But remember, Germany didn't have separation of powers and checks and balances, and a means of defeating Hitler. Lerner Hand once said that liberty lives and dies in the hearts of men and women, and Americans love liberty, and we would never allow a tyrant to remain in power. We might elect the tyrant once. That conceivably could happen. We came close to it with Andrew Jackson when he, who had been, a very, very bad person and became a populist, and Jacksonian democracy was designed to keep him in power, and he ended up, having a mixed presidency, doing some awful, awful things and doing some very good things, which is true of most bad presidents. Donald Trump did good things in the Middle East, did good things in American foreign policy, did terrible things when it came to trying to remain in office after he legitimately lost the election, did terrible things when he imposed the so-called Muslim ban, which is probably a misnomer, but nonetheless, it was wrong. And took the wrong attitudes, obviously, toward gay rights, toward abortion, toward separation of church and state, toward gun control, toward the environment. Those are all good reasons for voting against them. None of them are good reasons for violating the Constitution.
Let's go to what you call stretching the Constitution. And if we look at the myriad things that were employed against Donald Trump during his presidency and after, it is numerous. We can begin with the Mueller investigation. You have impeachment 1, you have impeachment 2, then you have the January 6th select committee investigation. Then you have now these charges brought by the district attorney in Manhattan, potentially more charges brought from Georgia. All of these things, while we may disagree with them, they are within the system. I mean, are any of these things actually unconstitutional? Congress has the right to investigate. Congress has the right to impeach. I would hope that there are some safeguards on a DA and I understand there are issues concerning things like a grand jury. The legal system is not perfect, but I would hope there are some safeguards that would keep a district attorney from just going out and being able to indict anyone at will.
There are no safeguards against unelected district attorneys. One of the weakest points in our constitutional system. In my book, Get Trump, I go through all of the attempts to get him and show what's wrong. Let's start with the impeachment. The impeachment was absolutely unconstitutional, the first impeachment. I wrote a book about it called The Case Against Impeaching Trump. You know what the original title of that book was? The original title was The Case Against Impeaching Hillary Clinton. I had thought she would get elected. The Republicans were claiming that they would impeach her on the day she was elected. And so I started to write a book about the constitutional basis for impeachment. And then, of course, the election turned out differently. And I wrote the same book, just about a different person. The Constitution is very specific as to what is a ground for impeachment: treason, bribery, or other, emphasize, high crimes and misdemeanors. In other words, other high crimes and misdemeanors like treason and bribery. The Democrats know that. And if Biden were impeached or had been impeached, or when Clinton was impeached, all the Democrats took the position I took. But when it came to Trump, they all said, no, it doesn't really apply to Trump. So it starts out with his clearly unconstitutional impeachment, and we have a system of checks and balances. The House impeached him and the Senate refused to convict him. So it worked in some respects. And the idea of running for office on the ground of getting somebody, I would like to see the law changed on that. I would like to see bar associations, and I go over this in my book, Get Trump, bar associations pass an ethical rule saying no prosecutor should ever run for office on the ground that he promises to get somebody. And if anybody ever does that, that prosecutor should be recused. You can't have a prosecutor saying, I'm going to get somebody, and then search through the statute books, find nothing, and then essentially make up a crime, and then try to get jurors who voted for him to serve on the jury to help him fulfill his campaign promise. It's hard to imagine anything worse in a society committed to the rule of law than the scenario I've just laid out. And yet a lot of good people, a lot of Democrats, including my former students, think it's perfectly okay to do that. And I'm going to continue writing and saying, no, it's not perfectly okay to do it. And if the Republicans tried to do it to Biden, I would be just as strongly opposed to it.
So, and I'm not going to win a debate against you on any of this. I am just a radio guy. But there is a very vigorous argument out there from many legal scholars, perhaps the majority of legal scholars, who do see impeachment differently than you do, who interpret high crimes and misdemeanors as being a very broad term. And I'm not going to argue whether that's right or not, but it seems within the course. Sorry.
Wrong. The point is they're a bunch of phonies and hypocrites, because they would take exactly the opposite point of view if the person impeached had been Hillary Clinton. They don't believe what they're saying. Give you one perfect example. This professor at Harvard who wrote an article before any of this happened, saying in the article, in the Harvard Law magazine, saying there must be a crime. Going further than me, I said criminal type behavior. This professor said there must be a crime. There must be a crime. And so I quoted him on the floor of the Senate. And then he went on television saying, not against Trump, there mustn't be a crime. I mean, he changed his view completely. So I don't believe there are really scholars out there who take that position. There's no more hypocritical group of people that I've experienced in my 60 years of academia than professors. And so they'll say, many of them will say anything to be adored by their students, to get high rankings, to get offers from other universities. So don't take seriously what these folks say, because they would agree with me if the shoe were on the other foot. So I don't even give them the benefit of the doubt, saying that they believe that the impeachment provision applies to abuse of power. There is no legitimate scholar who 20 years ago would have said that a Democrat can be impeached, whether it be Obama or whether it be Clinton, could be impeached for so-called abuse of power. 44 presidents have been accused of abuse of power. It is the most common phrase used in politics. Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Lincoln, Obama were all accused of abuse of power. And I don't think any scholar who calls himself a scholar would ever actually argue that the framers intended abuse of power to be a basis for impeachment. If they did, why didn't they say it? One of the framers said, let's have maladministration. And Madison said, no, because that would turn us into the British system, where Parliament can simply get rid of the prime minister. It would allow Congress to get rid of the president. And so the framers were very careful to put in words like treason, bribery, other high crimes and misdemeanors. A misdemeanor is a crime. So other high crimes and misdemeanors requires criminal conduct. Go back to Blackstone. I did all the research. I am right, and they are all wrong. What's worse than being wrong is they don't believe what they're saying. They're just making it up in order to get Trump. It's part of the get Trump syndrome. And I challenge, and I have challenged, any academic to debate me on this issue. Not a single one has taken me up. Not Lawrence Tribe, not anyone has taken me up on the offer to debate what the constitutional criteria for impeachment are, because they know they would lose the debate, not because of my debating skills, but because I actually did the research and I read every word of every constitutional convention, not only the Constitutional Convention for the United States, but the ratifying conventions. And there is no plausible argument. And nobody in the 19th century made that argument. All the scholars in the 19th century took my position. that the words of the Constitution mean what they say: treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. A misdemeanor is a crime. Do you know that in the common law you could be executed for a misdemeanor? There were capital misdemeanors. The difference between a capital misdemeanor and a capital felony is if you were convicted of a capital misdemeanor, your family was not attainted. There was no attainting of blood. If you were convicted of a capital felony, the family suffered. So, but the word misdemeanor to apply to abuse of power is just a distortion of language. And it's a distortion of language for partisan political purposes. So I renew my challenge. I'll debate anybody on the issue of what the framers meant when they said treason, bribery, other high crimes, and misdemeanor. There is no ambiguity about it. The only question is, does it apply equally to Democrats and Republicans? And according to many scholars, no, it does not.
Well, ultimately, and I want to be careful here because our time is limited, and I don't want to get too sidetracked on just this one issue, but the Constitution does give the sole power of impeachment to the House of Representatives. Hence, whatever the House of Representatives deemed appropriate to impeach an official would fall within constitutional bounds.
No, that's not right. Well, then why didn't they just say the House of Representatives shall have the power to impeach on any grounds? They limited the power to impeach on 4 specific grounds. And there are 2 justices of the Supreme Court who have argued, and I think they're right, that if the House were to impeach on the ground that the person who was president was the first African American ever elected, let's impeach Obama because he's black, you don't think the Supreme Court would intervene? Of course they would. So the sole power, President Ford was wrong and Congressman Waters was wrong when they said impeachment is whatever the House says it is and whatever the Senate votes it is. No, everybody in the House and the Senate has to take an oath of office to support the Constitution.
I feel like if that were to happen, and I know it's an extreme example, but if Barack Obama was impeached because he was black and the Supreme Court came in and said it was wrong, obviously it's wrong, but I suspect that would be a constitutional crisis at that point because it's not really, there is no check on the House and who they can impeach.
The Supreme Court would win that constitutional crisis. The American public would support the Supreme Court on that issue, and they would not support impeaching somebody on a ground not laid out in the Constitution. And so our system of checks and balances requires that nothing be left to one single branch of the government, including impeachment. And so impeachment is not just in the hands of the House. It has to be done consistently with the Constitution. And the whole get Trump attitude is inconsistent with the Constitution. Remember, too, that the Constitution there's only 2 provisions in the Constitution before the Bill of Rights is enacted that prohibit legislative action. One is Bill of Attainder, and the other is ex post facto law. And what's happening to Trump is essentially a Bill of Attainder. What people are saying is, it's Trump, he's the guy, let's get him, now let's find reasons for getting him. And that's just unconstitutional. It's in violation of the spirit of the Constitution, and I believe it's in violation of the letters of the Constitution. And I believe most academics would agree with me if the shoe were on the other foot. In some respects, I really wish it had been Hillary Clinton who had been elected and impeached, because the dynamics would have changed completely. And I would have been the most popular person on the face of, on Martha's Vineyard and in New York City instead of being a pariah, because I applied the same constitutional text to the wrong person. Well, I'm very proud of that.
Let's talk about the January 6th committee, the select committee investigating the attacks on the Capitol. I actually share some of your concerns and how the committee operated. It was sort of unprecedented, the way it proceeded. However, I will point out Republicans could have had other members on that committee rather than Adam Kinzinger and Lynn Cheney, but chose not to because they couldn't have their preferred choice of someone like Jim Jordan being on. So it is a little more complicated. That all said, and so but nonetheless, I do share some of your concerns how it was operating, how most testimony was behind closed doors, how they just picked certain clips from certain people like William Barr without hearing everything William Barr had to say. That was sort of a change from your usual laborious and long congressional hearing where you get a full airing of what's going on. So
the worst thing was when they put the President Trump's speech of January 6th and they doctored the tape. And they omitted the key words, I want you to protest peacefully and patriotically. If a lawyer ever did that in a court proceeding, the lawyer would be disciplined, perhaps disbarred. The only way you can get away with that is if you have a completely one-sided committee. I agree with you. I think that the Republicans made a terrible mistake. They should have put other people on the committee. And I think that the Democrats would have put the two people who were token Republicans on the committee as well. But at least there would have been one or two Republicans. And it was a mistake on both parts, and it gave no legitimacy to the committee at all. So although the committee came up with some interesting documents, and the documents are self-proving, the conclusions themselves are worthless because of the nature of the committee and the way it operated.
But it is worth noting that practically everyone, except for a very few exceptions, who testified to this committee were Republicans and were even Trump supporters, ranging from leaders of Republican leaders of state legislatures to inside the White House. And everyone put out, together put this narrative that seemed pretty convincing that Donald Trump had planned to allege that the election was stolen, that Donald Trump knew or should have known from the people that he was talking to that the election wasn't stolen, that he pressured state legislatures to try to change the outcome, that he pressured Mike Pence to try to change the outcome, and so on and so on. And yes, he did say go protest peacefully at the Capitol, but I think anyone who watches that speech, it's hard not to see it as an incendiary moment to inspire people to go and potentially pull off what happened there. Yeah, and it's all Republicans that are doing this, and this does. That makes it look like Trump is this strong man who's willing to use the systems of the rules to just benefit himself while hurting the system itself.
Why I don't want to see him president. That's why I voted against him, and that's why many Republicans have become never Trumpers. Just because a person's a Republican doesn't mean that their testimony is to be completely credited. Trump has a way of turning friends into enemies.
But do you let this go unpunished or uninvestigated or unlooked into and just say this is just what happens? And
no, you punish crime. You don't punish it if there's no crime. And if there's no crime, you use it as a basis for voting against him. Trump will not be elected president of the United States. He will get the Republican nomination because he has this. All you need is 25-30% of the people in the country to support somebody to get the nomination. But he won't get elected because of all the things you've described. Americans have rejected him in the marketplace of ideas. And that's the best way of the most important check and balance is the voting booth. And Trump is incapable of winning for presidency unless, of course, the Democrats nominate Bernie Sanders. Then he'll be elected. But if the Democrats nominate anybody who is reasonable or centrist, that person, he or she, will beat Trump because Trump has so many negatives resulting from all the points you've made. The important critical distinction in a democracy is drawing the line between political sin and actual crime. And that's a line that I think a lot of people, including you and some of your comments here, seem to be willing to at least perhaps fudge. Yes, he did wrong. Yes, he was a strong man. Yes, he wanted to do all these things. Yes, he put pressure on Pence. But where's the crime? That's the question.
You don't think it's called to the Georgia Secretary of State?
60 years. That, for me, that's always the critical question. Where is the crime? Where is the moment where a defendant makes the Hamlet soliloquy, standing there saying to be or not to be a felon, to cross that line into felony? And I haven't seen the evidence. Maybe it's there. And if it's there, I'd like to see it because I'd be in favor of prosecuting him if he did commit a crime. But I'm not in favor of stretching the criminal law to fit him because we don't like what he did.
You don't think it's called to the Georgia Secretary of State potentially could be criminal?
That's a close question because he said find. Find has a dictionary meaning. Find means it's there. All you have to do is look hard. The obvious meaning of that call was there are uncounted votes that haven't been found and haven't been counted. If he had said concoct, make up, invent, that would be different. Maybe he meant that. I don't get into his head. I can't get into his head, but neither can the criminal law. You have to take his words as he said them, and the word was fine. And unless there's some of the tapes that we don't know about, But the find case is the easiest one because under what's called the principle of lenity, you always have to interpret facts favorable to the defendant when there are ambiguities. The same thing with law, the same thing with fact. So when he said, find me, I need to find 1,100 votes, that has an obvious meaning. He may have meant something else, but that's not what he said. You don't convict people on the basis of what they meant. You convict them on the basis of what they've said. So no, I think that's an easy case.
Finally, I'm not unsympathetic, actually, to the arguments that you're making and the current concerns that people have concerning how Democrats are running things. My bigger concern is that when I've been following politics enough to know when one side escalates its tactics, the other side will meet it and even surpass it. And we're in this process, and I think we're seeing it right now by House Republicans.
I agree.
And I mean, this is sort of the formula that brought down the Roman Republic, the escalation of tactics.
And I emphasize this in my book. I have a whole chapter on this, is that the Republicans will use this as a precedent to go after Democrats. And as I say, today it's Trump, tomorrow it's Biden, the next day it's Uncle Charlie and your nephew and niece. Once, H.L. Mencken once said, the first abuses occur when they go after the SOBs because nobody cares. And then they establish the precedent on the SOBs and they go after the rest of us. And that's what's happening with Get Trump. There's a lot of sympathy among my friends and relatives. We don't care what the law is done, what happens to the law, how it's distorted, as long as it gets Trump. But we would care deeply if they use the same rules to get a Democrat or to get a Republican who they like. But they can't control that because once the genie's out of the bottle, you can't put it back. And we saw what Jim Jordan is doing, and we saw what others are doing. They're gonna play tit for tat, and we're gonna get local DAs going after Hunter Biden and targeting him, maybe going after others as well. We're gonna see that. It's inevitable, and that's why whether you're a Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative, you can't be on the side of getting Trump. And that's why most of my readers are liberal Democrats. Get Trump is a bestseller on Amazon, although they're not selling it at independent bookstores, interestingly enough, because they don't like the title. But it's doing very well on Amazon. And I assure you, a lot of the readers are people who don't like Trump, but they just don't want to see precedents that can be used against people they do like. And that's the audience for whom I wrote the book largely.
Alan Dershowitz has been our guest. He has joined us to talk about his book. It's called Get Trump, The Threat to Civil Liberties, Due Process, and Our Constitutional Rule of Law. Alan Dershowitz, I thank you for taking time to join us today.
Thank you. That was an excellent interview. I like hard questions, and I'm glad you asked them. Thanks.